Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something that might surprise you. The intimate world of feudal Japan, where honor and desire intertwined in ways that would reshape an entire civilization. We're talking about sex, power, and the complex relationships between samurai warriors and courtesans in a society that viewed sexuality through a completely different lens than our own. So, before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're a 17-year-old samurai apprentice in Edo period Japan. The year is 1650, and everything you thought you knew about love, sex, and relationships is about to be turned upside down. Because in this world, your sexual education doesn't come from fumbling around in the dark or whispered conversations behind closed doors. It comes from your master, your mentor, the man who's teaching you how to wield a sword and die with honor. And yes, that education is deeply, intimately physical. Welcome to a world where male relationships weren't just accepted among the warrior class. They were considered essential to proper samurai development, where the most refined courtesans commanded prices that could bankrupt lesser nobles, where sex wasn't shameful or hidden, but celebrated in art so explicit it would make modern audiences blush. This isn't the Japan of cherry blossoms and tea ceremonies that most people imagine. This is the Japan of Wakashudo, Shunga, and pleasure districts that never slept. The sexual culture of samurai and courtesans during Japan's Edo period represents one of history's most fascinating examples of how sexuality, social hierarchy, and cultural expression could create something entirely unique. From 1603 to 1868, Japan developed sexual practices and attitudes that were fundamentally different from anything happening in the Christian West. While European societies were busy condemning most forms of sexual expression, Japan was creating an elaborate system where different types of relationships served different social functions, and where sexual pleasure was seen as separate from marriage, family, and social duty. But here's what makes this story even more compelling. The relationships we're talking about weren't just tolerated, they were actively encouraged as part of proper samurai education. The older warrior, called the ninja, would take a younger apprentice, the Wakashu, under his wing. And this wasn't just about learning swordplay or military tactics. This was a complete mentorship that included intimate physical relationships, emotional bonding, and a commitment that was expected to last for life. The younger partner was typically between 13 and 19 years old, though some relationships began even earlier. These bonds were formalized through actual ceremonies, recognized by families, and seen as legitimate and honorable connections that strengthened the entire military class through personal loyalty and shared training. The relationship was expected to be mutually ennobling, with the older partner becoming more honorable through his role as teacher, while the younger learned not just martial skills but the deeper codes of samurai conduct. Now, before you start thinking this was some kind of free-for-all, understand that these relationships were governed by strict codes of conduct. Both parties were expected to be loyal unto death, to assist each other in feudal duties, honor-driven obligations, duels, and vendettas. The sexual aspect was expected to end when the boy came of age, but the relationship itself was meant to develop into a lifelong bond of friendship and mutual support. What's particularly fascinating is that this system didn't exclude relationships with women. Sexual activity with women wasn't barred for either party. And once the boy matured, both were free to seek other Wakashu lovers or pursue marriages with women. This created a complex web of relationships that defined samurai culture for centuries, where different types of love and sexual expression served different purposes in a warrior's life. The religious context makes this even more interesting. Unlike Christian societies, where homosexuality was considered sinful, Japanese Buddhism and Shintoism had very different attitudes towards sexuality. In fact, Buddhist monasteries were actually the original source of these male relationships that later spread to the samurai class. Monks openly engaged with their young acolytes despite their religious vows, because the religious framework didn't view same-sex relationships as inherently more polluted or sinful than heterosexual ones. According to Shinto mythology, sex was seen in a positive light. The very creation of Japan was attributed to a symbolic sexual act between the gods Izanagi and Izanami. The first Japanese island, Onogoro, was created through divine ejaculation, while the other islands emerged from the goddess's womb. This meant that sexuality, in all its forms, was viewed as a natural and even sacred part of existence, rather than something to be ashamed of or hidden. But here's where the story gets really interesting. The Edo period brought massive social changes that would transform how these sexual relationships functioned throughout Japanese society. The Tokugawa shogunate commanded that all samurai move to castle cities, creating unprecedented population booms. By 1700, Edo had over 1 million people, making it one of the largest cities in the world. Kyoto and Osaka had nearly 400,000 residents each. This was the first time there was so much interaction between the samurai class and common people, which meant that the practices of nanshoku and wakashudo were being exposed to much broader segments of society. As one contemporary writer put it, Edo had become a city of bachelors, not unlike the monasteries of Mount Koya. This was a euphemistic way of describing a city with a thriving culture of male relationships that extended far beyond the traditional samurai class. Peasants who had migrated to the cities for work were suddenly exposed to ideas and practices that had previously been confined to the warrior elite. This urbanization created new opportunities for sexual commerce and entertainment that would define Japanese sexuality for the next 3 centuries. As Japan entered a period of peace, the traditional system of training apprentices for war became less practical. The samurai class was becoming poorer, and maintaining a personal apprentice became just another mouth to feed. It was easier for warriors to take their government-issued stipend to the nearest red light district and simply pay for what they wanted, when they wanted it. Soon, prostitution expanded beyond brothels and into the theatres. Many amateur Kabuki actors were actually male prostitutes in disguise, highly sought after by both men and women. When not performing on stage, they were likely in bed with paying admirers. This commercialization of sexuality created an entirely new economy of pleasure that served all social classes, though still with strict hierarchies that mirrored the broader society. The transformation from personal mentorship relationships to commercial transactions fundamentally altered the nature of same-sex relationships in Japan. What had once been deeply personal bonds between warriors became more transactional, but also more accessible to people outside the traditional samurai class. The intimacy and honor that had characterized Wakashudo relationships began to give way to a more market-driven approach to sexual pleasure. This shift coincided with the establishment of official pleasure districts, the most famous being Yoshiwara in Edo. In 1617, new laws restricted brothels to designated pleasure quarters, including Yoshiwara in Edo, Shimabara in Kyoto, and Shinmachi in Osaka. These districts bloomed into isolated neighborhoods that offered far more than just sexual services. They provided fine dining, wine, singing and dancing performances, and parlor games, creating complete entertainment complexes. To keep children and criminals out, and to keep the sex workers in, these districts were enclosed by moats. To visitors, they appeared to be islands, which is how they came to be known as the floating world. By law, patrons were only allowed to stay for 1 night at a time, but like most official policies governing these areas, this rule was rarely enforced. Many visitors stayed in the red light districts for days on end. A trip to Yoshiwara was described as an opportunity to slip out of time itself. Instead of the rigid social hierarchies that governed daily life in Edo, the pleasure districts operated under a new hierarchy based on aesthetic, sensual, and sexual pleasure. Here, Money could buy access to experiences that were impossible in the outside world, where every interaction was governed by complex rules of class, family obligation, and social duty. The women who worked in these districts, known collectively as yujo or women of pleasure, existed within their own complex hierarchy. Ordinary prostitutes could rise to become koshi, or second-level courtesans. The most successful might become taiyu, high-level courtesans, and the absolute elite could achieve the rank of Oiran, literally meaning castle topplers, suggesting their power to bring down even the mightiest men. But this hierarchy came with increasingly elaborate and expensive requirements. The taiyu were cut off from society, locked into what one observer called gilded cages of endless pleasure. This led to increasingly stifling rituals of clothing, hair, and behavior that drove up their prices to meet the costs of these outlandish displays. By the height of their profession, Oiran wore upwards of 8 large kanzashi, elaborate hair ornaments made from tortoiseshell, silver, gold, and gemstones, in their large, heavily waxed hairstyles. The appearance of these elite courtesans was markedly different from both geisha and average women, reflecting the upper-class tastes and expectations of their wealthy customers. The elaborate rituals surrounding high-level courtesans included complex negotiations, gift-giving ceremonies, and demonstrations of cultural sophistication that could take months before any sexual contact occurred. This wasn't simply about physical pleasure. It was about participating in an elaborate cultural performance that demonstrated refinement, wealth, and social status. The only times courtesans were allowed to leave Yoshiwara were if a patron paid an enormous sum to have her spend an entire night with him outside the district, or during Ohanami, the spring cherry blossom viewing season. Otherwise, these women lived their entire lives within the confines of the pleasure quarters, their existence dedicated entirely to providing entertainment and sexual services to men who could afford their company. This system created a strange paradox, where the most celebrated and expensive women in Japanese society were also the most constrained and exploited. While Oiran commanded incredible sums and wielded significant cultural influence, they were also essentially prisoners whose lives were entirely controlled by the brothel owners who claimed to own them. Many had been sold into this life as children by impoverished parents, and the debt system was designed to ensure they could never buy their freedom. The cultural impact of these pleasure districts extended far beyond their walls. Yoshiwara influenced kabuki theatre, vocal music, flower arrangement, comic poetry, haikai poetry, the tea ceremony, fashion, woodblock printing, publishing, and festivals. The district served as a cultural laboratory where new artistic styles, social customs, and forms of entertainment were developed and then spread throughout Japanese society. By the 17th century, woodblock printing technology had advanced to the point where artistic works could be distributed quickly and widely throughout the country. This technological advancement would prove crucial for documenting and disseminating the sexual culture that was flourishing in Japan's urban centers, creating a visual record of practices and attitudes that would otherwise have been lost to history. This technological revolution gave birth to Shunga, literally meaning spring pictures, a genre of erotic art that would become one of the most explicit and widely consumed forms of visual media in human history. These weren't hidden away like pornography in Christian societies. Shunga was openly enjoyed by all social classes throughout the Edo period, despite being officially frowned upon by the ruling authorities. The artwork was incredibly detailed and graphic, showing sexual activities with an anatomical frankness that would shock many modern viewers. But Shunga served purposes far beyond simple arousal or entertainment. These prints functioned as educational materials for newlyweds, providing practical guidance on sexual techniques and positions that were considered essential knowledge for married couples entering their new lives together. The superstitions surrounding Shunga reveal just how integrated sexuality was into daily Japanese life. Samurai warriors carried these erotic prints tucked into their armor as lucky charms against death in battle. Merchants kept them in their warehouses, believing they would prevent fires from destroying their goods. The logic was rooted in traditional beliefs about the harmony of yin and yang, where sexual intercourse symbolized cosmic balance and protection. Housewives possessed collections of Shunga, and they were commonly given as wedding gifts, serving as instruction manuals for the wedding night. The prince sought to normalize sexual expression despite the cold formality of Confucian social codes that dominated public life. In a society where official doctrine emphasized restraint and social hierarchy, Shunga provided a space where human desire could be acknowledged and celebrated. The artists who created these works were often the same masters producing the most celebrated ukiyo-e prints of the era. Names like Katsushika Hokusai and Utagawa Kuniyoshi, famous for their landscapes and historical scenes, also created some of the most explicit sexual imagery ever produced. This wasn't considered a contradiction or a fall from artistic grace. Instead, it demonstrated the complete integration of sexuality into Japanese aesthetic culture. Traveling lending libraries brought Shunga to rural areas, ensuring that even peasants in remote villages had access to these visual representations of urban sexual culture. The prints depicted not just heterosexual encounters, but the full spectrum of sexual practices that were common in Edo society, including the male relationships that remained central to samurai culture, and the commercial sexual services available in the pleasure districts. But behind this artistic celebration of sexuality lay darker realities that the beautiful prints couldn't capture. The women working in the pleasure districts lived lives of brutal exploitation that contradicted the romantic imagery surrounding their profession. Most of the over 3,000 women working in Yoshiwara were there because their impoverished parents had sold them as young girls to pay off family debts. The brothel keepers essentially owned these women for life, and many were never able to escape this bondage. The debt system was deliberately designed to be impossible to overcome. No matter how much money a courtesan earned, the costs of her elaborate clothing, cosmetics, living expenses, and the interest on her original purchase price ensured that she remained trapped in an endless cycle of obligation. Their lives were harsh and often tragically short. Many died young from sexually transmitted diseases, violence, or the simple wear of being forced to service multiple customers every day for years on end. Medical care was limited, and the women had no legal protection from abuse or exploitation. When they died, their bodies were often simply discarded by being thrown over the walls of nearby Jokanji Temple, which became known as Nagekomi Dera, the throwaway temple, where monks would dispose of the corpses. This brutal reality existed alongside the celebration of these same women in art, literature, and popular culture. The most famous courtesans became celebrities, their images reproduced in countless prints, their fashion choices copied by women throughout society, their wit and artistic accomplishments celebrated in poems and stories. Yet they remained prisoners, their beauty and talent commodified for the pleasure of men who could afford their services. The contradiction reveals something essential about Edo period sexuality. While the culture was remarkably open about sexual desire and practice, it was still fundamentally structured around male pleasure and male power. Women existed within this system primarily to serve male needs, whether as wives focused on reproduction and household management, or as courtesans providing sexual and artistic entertainment. Even the celebrated Geisha, who emerged as a distinct class separate from prostitutes, operated within these same constraints. Although geisha were officially forbidden from holding prostitution licenses and were supposed to sell their artistic skills rather than their bodies, the reality was more complex. While they weren't technically prostitutes, many geisha did engage in sexual relationships with wealthy patrons who served as their protectors and financial supporters. The distinction between geisha and courtesans became increasingly important as Japanese society sought to create more refined forms of female entertainment. Geisha were artists first, trained in traditional music, dance, and conversation. They provided sophisticated companionship that went beyond physical pleasure to include intellectual and cultural engagement. Yet they too lived constrained lives, bound by contracts to the houses that trained them, their movements and relationships controlled by economic obligations. This system of female entertainment existed parallel to the continuing traditions of male relationships among the samurai class, though these too were changing as Japanese society evolved. The passionate intensity of traditional Wakashudo relationships sometimes led to dramatic consequences that became the stuff of literature and theatre. Interestingly, the number one cause of revenge killings during the Edo period was discord between male lovers, not disputes over women or family honor. Stories from the period describe lovers cutting off their own hands or fingers as proof of their devotion, or committing suicide when their relationships ended. These tales of passionate love and violent jealousy became central themes in Japanese literature and theatre, reflecting the intensity of emotions that sexual relationships could generate in a society where honor and shame carried life or death consequences. The intersection of honor, desire, and social obligation created volatile situations that often ended in tragedy. Such dramatic tales became popular entertainment, romanticizing the tragic consequences of forbidden or unrequited love, while serving as cautionary examples of the dangers of uncontrolled passion. Audiences flocked to Kabuki performances and read popular novels that depicted these doomed relationships with a mixture of fascination and moral instruction. Marriage practices during this period created yet another layer of complexity in Japanese sexual culture. Romantic love played little part in medieval marriages, which were arranged based on political and economic considerations rather than personal affection. A popular proverb warned that those who come together in passion stay together in tears, suggesting that emotional attachment was actually considered dangerous to stable family relationships. For men, sexual gratification was understood to be completely separate from conjugal relations with their wives, where the primary purpose was procreation and family continuity. During the Tokugawa period, marriages among the samurai and wealthy merchant classes required the consent of political authorities and were based on maintaining or improving social status rather than personal compatibility or attraction. This separation of marriage from sexual pleasure created a society where men were not only permitted, but expected to seek sexual satisfaction outside their marriages, while maintaining their wives as honored partners in family management and child rearing. Women of higher social classes were expected to accept their husbands' extramarital activities as normal and proper, while remaining faithful themselves and focusing on their roles as mothers and household managers. The practice of Omiai, formal matchmaking meetings, emerged during this period as a way to arrange suitable marriages within the appropriate social classes. These meetings were carefully orchestrated encounters where families could evaluate potential matches based on social standing, economic prospects, and family reputation, rather than personal attraction or romantic compatibility. This compartmentalization of different types of relationships allowed Edo society to function with what might seem like contradictory attitudes towards sexuality. The same man might maintain a loving but non-sexual relationship with his wife, passionate but temporary relationships with young male apprentices, and commercial but emotionally detached relationships with courtesans, all while being considered a model of proper social conduct. The cultural infrastructure that supported this complex sexual landscape was remarkably sophisticated. Beyond the major pleasure districts, networks of tea houses, assignation houses, traveling performers, and cultural institutions created a web of sexual commerce that reached into every corner of Japanese society. Musicians, artists, writers, and performers all gathered in the pleasure districts, creating vibrant intellectual scenes that influenced every aspect of Japanese culture. These cultural centers served as more than just places of sexual commerce. They were laboratories for innovation, where new forms of art, entertainment, and social interaction were constantly being developed. The influence flowed outward from these districts, shaping fashion trends that would spread to respectable society, inspiring artistic movements that would define Japanese aesthetics for generations, and creating forms of popular entertainment that would become central to Japanese cultural identity. The integration of sexuality into daily life was facilitated by a network that most people today would find astounding in its openness and complexity. Traveling performers brought songs, stories, and artistic styles from the pleasure districts to rural communities. Publishers distributed not just Shunga, but also popular novels, poetry collections, and theatrical scripts that celebrated the romantic and sexual adventures of both historical and contemporary figures. Even religious festivals incorporated elements that had originated in the pleasure districts. The boundaries between sacred and profane, respectable and disreputable, were far more fluid than they would become in later periods of Japanese history. This wasn't a society that compartmentalized sexuality into a separate, shameful sphere of human experience. Instead, sexual expression was woven into the fabric of daily life, art, religion, and social interaction. The economic impact of this sexual culture was enormous. The pleasure districts generated massive revenue, not just from direct sexual services, but from the entire ecosystem of entertainment, dining, fashion, and artistic production that surrounded them. Wealthy merchants and samurai would spend fortunes not just on courtesans, but on the elaborate rituals and cultural performances that accompanied their relationships with these women. A single evening with a high-ranking Oiran might cost more than a skilled craftsman earned in a year, but the customer wasn't just paying for sexual access. They were purchasing entry into an elaborate cultural performance that demonstrated their refinement, wealth, and understanding of sophisticated artistic traditions. The courtesan had to be not just physically attractive, but also accomplished in music, dance, poetry, conversation, and the intricate social rituals that governed these interactions. This created a strange economy where cultural sophistication and sexual desire were inextricably linked. Men competed not just to afford the most expensive courtesans, but to demonstrate that they possessed the cultural knowledge necessary to appreciate and interact with these women appropriately. The pleasure districts became schools of refinement, where wealthy but culturally unsophisticated merchants could learn the arts of poetry, music, and sophisticated conversation. The seasonal rhythms of this sexual culture followed the natural cycles that governed all aspects of Japanese life. Spring brought cherry blossom viewing parties where courtesans could leave their districts, providing rare opportunities for public display of their beauty and accomplishments. Summer festivals created occasions for elaborate processions and performances. Autumn moon viewing parties inspired poetry competitions and artistic collaborations. Winter brought more intimate gatherings focused on conversation, music, and the appreciation of carefully prepared food and drink. Each season brought its own aesthetic requirements, its own forms of entertainment, and its own opportunities for the display of wealth and cultural sophistication. The courtesans' wardrobes had to reflect not just their rank within the pleasure district hierarchy, but also the subtle seasonal associations that governed Japanese aesthetic sensibility. A single inappropriate color choice or seasonal reference could mark someone as culturally ignorant and unworthy of access to the most elite levels of the entertainment world. The language used in these contexts was also highly specialized and coded. Direct references to sexual activities were considered crude and inappropriate, even in contexts where everyone understood the ultimate purpose of the interaction. Instead, elaborate systems of metaphor, poetry, and indirect reference allowed participants to communicate their desires and intentions while maintaining the fiction of cultural refinement and artistic appreciation. This linguistic complexity meant that successful participation in the pleasure districts required not just wealth, but also education and cultural sophistication. Men who could compose appropriate poetry, understand musical performances, appreciate seasonal references, and engage in witty conversation were far more likely to gain access to the most celebrated courtesans than those who simply arrived with money but no cultural knowledge. The training required to operate successfully in this world was extensive and began early. Young men from wealthy families were often introduced to the pleasure districts by older relatives or family friends who could teach them the appropriate forms of behavior, the proper ways to approach and interact with different levels of courtesans, and the cultural knowledge necessary to avoid embarrassing themselves or their families. This educational function of the pleasure districts extended beyond mere social instruction. Many young samurai and merchants received their first serious exposure to poetry, music, theatre, and sophisticated artistic traditions through their relationships with courtesans and geisha. The women working in these districts were often better educated and more culturally sophisticated than the wives these men would eventually marry, creating a situation where sexual relationships served as vehicles for cultural education. The implications of this system were profound and far-reaching. It created a society where the most culturally accomplished and intellectually sophisticated women were also those whose bodies and talents were for sale to wealthy men. Meanwhile, the wives of these same men were expected to remain largely uneducated, confined to domestic roles, and focus primarily on reproduction and household management. This division had lasting effects on Japanese gender relations and cultural development. The pleasure districts became centers of female artistic achievement and intellectual activity, but only within the context of male sexual and economic dominance. Women could achieve fame, wealth, and cultural influence, but only by commodifying their sexuality and accepting lives of constraint and exploitation. The artistic documentation of this world provides us with an incredibly detailed picture of sexual practices and attitudes that would otherwise be lost to history. Beyond the famous Shunga prints, we have thousands of poems, songs, stories, and theatrical works that describe the emotional, social, and physical aspects of relationships between samurai and courtesans, between men and their Wakashudo partners, and between the various participants in Japan's complex sexual economy. These literary works reveal the psychological and emotional dimensions of relationships that official histories often ignore. We can read accounts of jealousy, passion, tenderness, brutality, and romantic love that show how individual people experienced and understood their sexual relationships within the broader social and cultural constraints of Edo society. The letters and poems exchanged between lovers provide particularly intimate glimpses into private emotional lives. Men wrote passionate verses to their Wakashudo partners, describing their longing during separations and their devotion despite the temporary nature of these relationships. Courtesans composed poems for their patrons that walk the delicate line between genuine affection and commercial necessity, revealing the complex emotional negotiations required by their profession. Even the business records of the pleasure districts provide insights into the practical realities of commercialized sexuality. We can track the prices charged by different levels of courtesans, the seasonal variations in demand, the costs of maintaining the elaborate costumes and cultural performances, and the financial arrangements that bound women to their brothel owners. These records reveal the enormous sums of money that flowed through the sexual economy and the complex financial relationships that made the system possible. They also document the brutal reality of debt bondage that trapped most of the women working in these districts, showing how economic exploitation underlay even the most refined and culturally sophisticated sexual relationships. The medical texts of the period provide another window into the physical realities of Edo sexuality. Japanese physicians wrote detailed treatises on sexual techniques, fertility, sexually transmitted diseases, and the physical care of both courtesans and their customers. These medical works were remarkably frank about sexual practices and problems, reflecting a cultural attitude that saw sexuality as a natural part of human life that required practical knowledge and skill. The medical literature also reveals the serious health consequences of the pleasure district system. Sexually transmitted diseases were rampant, and women working as prostitutes had little access to effective treatment. Unwanted pregnancies were handled through crude and dangerous abortion techniques, and the physical wear of serving multiple customers daily led to premature aging and early death for many women. Yet even these harsh realities were incorporated into the artistic and literary culture surrounding the pleasure districts. Stories of courtesans dying young became romantic tragedies that were celebrated in popular literature and theatre. The suffering of these women was transformed into entertainment for the very audiences whose patronage had caused that suffering in the first place. The international context of Japanese sexuality during this period makes it even more remarkable. While Japan was developing this sophisticated and open sexual culture, most of the rest of the world was moving toward increasingly restrictive attitudes about sexual expression. Christian societies were condemning homosexuality, limiting women's roles, and treating sexuality as fundamentally sinful and dangerous. The contrast with European societies of the same period is particularly striking. While Japanese samurai were openly engaging in relationships with young male apprentices, European men who engaged in similar relationships faced execution or imprisonment. While Japanese artists were creating thousands of explicit sexual images for mass consumption, European societies were banning even mildly suggestive artwork and literature. This cultural divergence would have profound implications when Japan was eventually forced to open to Western influence in the mid-19th century. The collision between Japanese sexual openness and Western sexual repression would create tensions and contradictions that Japanese society is still working through today. But for the moment, in the floating world of Edo Japan, sexuality remained integrated into a complex cultural system that celebrated human desire while channeling it through elaborate social and artistic forms. The relationships between samurai and their apprentices, between wealthy merchants and sophisticated courtesans, between artists and their patrons, all took place within a framework that saw sexual expression as natural, necessary, and worthy of artistic celebration. The legacy of this period would influence Japanese culture for centuries to come, creating artistic traditions, social customs, and attitudes towards sexuality that would persist even as the specific institutions that supported them disappeared. The aesthetic sensibilities developed in the pleasure districts would influence everything from clothing design to architectural styles. The literary forms that emerged from this sexual culture would provide models for Japanese fiction and poetry. The integration of sexuality into daily cultural life would leave traces that can still be found in contemporary Japanese society. Understanding this world requires us to set aside many of our contemporary assumptions about sexuality, gender, and morality. The people living in Edo Japan weren't struggling with the same questions and conflicts that dominate modern discussions of sexuality. They were operating within a completely different framework of assumptions about what sexual relationships could mean and how they should function within a broader social system. Their approach to sexuality was fundamentally pragmatic rather than moralistic. Different types of relationships served different social functions, and there was no expectation that one person or one type of relationship should fulfill all emotional, sexual, and social needs. This compartmentalization allowed for a complexity of human experience that many modern people would find difficult to navigate or understand. The philosophical underpinnings of this sexual culture drew from both Buddhist and Confucian traditions, but in ways that created something uniquely Japanese. Buddhist concepts of impermanence and the illusory nature of physical existence actually supported rather than condemned sexual pleasure, since all worldly experiences were considered temporary anyway. The key was not to become too attached to any particular relationship or experience, but to appreciate beauty and pleasure when they were available. Confucian ideas about social harmony and proper relationships provided the structural framework within which these sexual practices operated. The emphasis on loyalty, respect for hierarchy, and fulfillment of social obligations meant that even the most passionate relationships were expected to serve broader social purposes. A samurai's relationship with his Wakashudo apprentice was valuable not just for the personal satisfaction it provided, but for the way it strengthened military bonds and passed down warrior traditions. This philosophical flexibility allowed Edo society to avoid many of the conflicts between desire and duty that plagued other cultures. Instead of seeing sexuality as fundamentally opposed to social order, Japanese thinkers found ways to integrate sexual expression into the maintenance of social stability. The pleasure districts weren't seen as threats to family life or social morality, but as necessary outlets that actually protected the stability of marriage and family relationships by providing alternative spaces for sexual expression. The seasonal festivals that punctuated the Japanese calendar provided regular opportunities for this sexual culture to manifest in public ways that would have been unthinkable in Christian societies. During certain festivals, normal social restrictions were temporarily suspended, allowing for displays of sexuality and eroticism that celebrated human desire as part of the natural order. The Bon Festival in summer, for instance, traditionally included dances and performances that were explicitly sexual in nature. Young people were expected to participate in these celebrations, which served both as entertainment and as informal opportunities for sexual education and partner selection. The festivals created sanctioned spaces where sexual energy could be expressed communally rather than being forced into purely private or commercial channels. Even more formal religious observances incorporated sexual symbolism in ways that demonstrated the integration of sexuality into spiritual life. Shinto fertility festivals included processions of giant wooden phalluses, dances that mimicked sexual acts, and rituals designed to ensure agricultural and human fertility. These weren't considered crude or inappropriate, but were understood as necessary celebrations of the life force that sustained both human society and the natural world. The artistic traditions that emerged from this culture created visual languages for depicting sexuality that were both explicit and aesthetically sophisticated. The techniques developed by Shunga artists for representing human bodies, sexual positions, and erotic scenarios influenced all forms of Japanese visual art, even those with no explicitly sexual content. The way these artists depicted flowing robes, intimate gestures, and emotional expressions in their erotic works became part of the broader vocabulary of Japanese aesthetic expression. You can see the influence of Shunga techniques in the way later artists painted everything from religious scenes to landscapes, demonstrating how thoroughly sexual imagery had been integrated into Japanese artistic culture. The printing technology that made Shunga possible also enabled the mass distribution of popular literature that celebrated the romantic and sexual adventures of both historical and fictional characters. These books weren't hidden away or sold secretly, but were openly available in shops throughout Japanese cities and were carried by traveling merchants to rural areas. The stories they contained ranged from romantic tales of star-crossed lovers to explicit guides for sexual technique, from humorous accounts of sexual mishaps to tragic tales of passion leading to death. This literature created a shared cultural vocabulary for discussing and understanding sexual experience that reached across class lines and geographic boundaries. Women as well as men were consumers of this erotic literature, and female authors contributed significantly to its development. Some of the most sophisticated and psychologically nuanced accounts of sexual relationships were written by women who drew on their own experiences in the pleasure districts or their observations of the sexual culture surrounding them. These female voices provide crucial insights into how women experienced and understood their roles in Edo sexual culture. While the system was undeniably structured around male pleasure and male power, the women who participated in it weren't simply passive victims. Many found ways to exercise agency, accumulate wealth and cultural capital, and create meaningful relationships even within the constraints of their circumstances. The most successful courtesans became celebrities, whose influence extended far beyond the pleasure districts. Their fashion choices were copied by women throughout society. Their artistic performances set standards that influenced professional entertainers. Their wit and intelligence were celebrated in popular culture. Some even used their positions to become informal political advisors, using their intimate relationships with powerful men to influence important decisions. The economic power that these women could accumulate was substantial, despite the debt bondage system that constrained their freedom. The most successful Oiran could command fees that exceeded the annual incomes of successful merchants or skilled craftsmen. While much of this money went to their brothel owners, some women were able to save enough to eventually purchase their freedom or establish their own entertainment establishments. The retirement of successful courtesans often involved them becoming managers or owners of tea houses, brothels, or other entertainment venues. This created a system where some women could transition from being commodities in the sexual economy to being entrepreneurs who controlled portions of that economy themselves. It wasn't common, and it required exceptional talent, luck, and business acumen, but it was possible. The training systems that produced both courtesans and geisha were remarkably sophisticated educational institutions, despite their ultimate purpose. Young girls entering these worlds received instruction not just in sexual techniques, but in music, dance, poetry, conversation, etiquette, and aesthetic appreciation. Many emerged with cultural educations that surpassed those of upper-class wives, who were often kept deliberately ignorant of intellectual and artistic pursuits. This educational function created a paradox, where the most accomplished and intellectually sophisticated women in Japanese society were also those whose lives were most constrained and whose bodies were treated as commercial commodities. The pleasure districts became centers of female learning and artistic achievement, but only within the context of male sexual consumption. The psychological costs of this system were enormous. Though they're often hidden in the artistic and literary accounts that have survived, the letters and poems written by courtesans reveal the emotional strain of maintaining artificial relationships with multiple customers while suppressing their own desires and preferences. The need to appear constantly available, attractive, and entertaining while living under conditions of essential imprisonment took a severe toll on mental health. Many women developed strategies for psychological survival that involved creating clear distinctions between their professional personas and their private selves. They would maintain inner lives that were completely separate from their work, often developing genuine friendships with other women in the districts or secret romantic relationships that provided emotional sustenance outside the commercial sexual economy. The religious practices of women in the pleasure districts also served psychological functions that went beyond their official spiritual purposes. Buddhist meditation and prayer provided ways of maintaining inner dignity and autonomy, even while their external lives were controlled by others. Some women became seriously committed practitioners, using religious discipline to create internal spaces of freedom that couldn't be commodified or controlled. The artistic work that many courtesans and geisha produced served similar functions. Poetry, painting, and musical composition provided outlets for authentic self-expression that existed alongside their commercial entertainment functions. Some of the most moving and accomplished art of the Edo period was created by women whose official social roles gave them no recognition as serious artists. The networks of relationships between women in the pleasure districts created informal support systems that helped them survive the physical and emotional challenges of their lives. Older women mentored younger ones, sharing practical knowledge about managing customers, avoiding violence, preventing pregnancy, and maintaining health. These relationships often became the most meaningful and lasting bonds in their lives. The ritual aspects of courtesan culture served multiple functions beyond their obvious role in justifying high prices and creating exotic entertainment for wealthy customers. The elaborate ceremonies surrounding interactions with high-level courtesans created structured environments where both the women and their customers could navigate intimate relationships according to established rules and expectations. These rituals provided protection for the women by creating predictable frameworks for interactions that might otherwise become unpredictable or dangerous. They also allowed customers to feel that they were participating in sophisticated cultural traditions rather than simply purchasing sexual services, which helped maintain the social fiction that these relationships were about refinement and aesthetic appreciation rather than crude physical transaction. The seasonal cycles that governed these rituals connected the pleasure districts to the broader rhythms of Japanese cultural life. The same aesthetic sensibilities that determined when to view cherry blossoms or compose moon-viewing poetry also shaped the timing and character of sexual relationships. This integration helped legitimize the pleasure districts as part of Japanese cultural tradition, rather than foreign corruptions or social aberrations. The music that accompanied these rituals was often composed specifically for individual courtesans or particular occasions, creating unique artistic works that existed nowhere else in Japanese culture. Some of this music achieved recognition beyond the pleasure districts and influenced the development of classical Japanese musical forms that are still performed today. The costume and makeup traditions developed in the pleasure districts had similarly lasting influence on Japanese aesthetic culture. The elaborate kimonos worn by Oiran, with their layers of silk, complex color combinations, and seasonal symbolic references, represented the pinnacle of textile artistry. The techniques developed for creating these garments influenced fashion throughout Japanese society and established aesthetic principles that continue to shape Japanese design. The makeup techniques used by courtesans and geisha created visual languages for expressing different moods, social positions, and seasonal associations. The white face powder, red lip paint, and dramatically darkened eyebrows weren't simply cosmetic choices, but were elements in a complex system of visual communication that could convey subtle messages about a woman's status, availability, and artistic accomplishments. Even the architecture of the pleasure districts influenced broader Japanese architectural traditions. The tea houses, brothels, and entertainment venues developed spatial arrangements that balanced privacy with display, intimacy with spectacle. The interior design principles that emerged from these spaces influenced the design of restaurants, theaters, and even private homes throughout Japanese society. The garden design associated with high-level pleasure establishments created miniature landscapes that compressed complex aesthetic and symbolic programs into very small spaces. These gardens had to provide beauty and tranquility, while also serving practical functions and operating within the commercial constraints of the entertainment business. The solutions developed by pleasure district gardeners influenced Japanese landscape design for centuries. The culinary traditions that developed around courtesan culture were equally influential. The meals served in high-level establishments had to demonstrate seasonal awareness, aesthetic sophistication, and cultural knowledge, while also serving practical functions as social lubricants and demonstrations of wealth. The presentation techniques, seasonal menus, and integration of food with other forms of entertainment created templates that influenced Japanese restaurant culture far beyond the pleasure districts. The drinking customs associated with these establishments were particularly elaborate, involving complex etiquettes around the serving and consumption of sake that turned alcohol consumption into performance art. These customs spread throughout Japanese society and became standard elements of business entertainment, social gatherings, and formal celebrations. The integration of games and contests into pleasure district entertainment created new forms of social interaction that combined intellectual competition with sexual display. Poetry contests, music competitions, and aesthetic games provided structured ways for customers to demonstrate their cultural sophistication while competing for the attention of particular courtesans. These competitive elements added layers of complexity to what might otherwise have been simple commercial transactions. Customers had to prove their worthiness, not just through wealth, but through cultural knowledge, artistic skill, and social grace. This created a system where access to the most desirable women required ongoing education and cultural development. The seasonal poetry competitions held in the pleasure districts brought together the most accomplished poets, both amateur and professional, in events that were as much about literary achievement as sexual commerce. The poems composed during these competitions were often preserved and circulated beyond the districts, contributing to the broader development of Japanese literature. The musical competitions similarly provided venues for innovation and experimentation that influenced the development of Japanese classical music. New instruments, new vocal techniques, and new compositional forms were often first developed and tested in the pleasure districts before being adopted by more respectable musical institutions. The dance traditions associated with courtesan culture were equally innovative and influential. The movement vocabulary developed by courtesans and geisha combined elements from classical court dance, folk traditions, and theatrical performance to create new forms of bodily expression that were both artistically sophisticated and sexually suggestive. These dance innovations influenced the development of Kabuki theatre, which drew heavily on pleasure district traditions for its movement vocabulary, costume design, and performance techniques. The boundary between legitimate theatre and pleasure district entertainment was often blurred, with performers moving freely between different types of venues and audiences. The storytelling traditions that flourished in the pleasure districts created new narrative forms that combined romantic adventure, sexual instruction, and moral commentary in ways that appealed to broad audiences across class lines. These stories were performed orally in tea houses and brothels, but were also written down and distributed as popular literature throughout Japan. The narrative techniques developed by pleasure district storytellers influenced the development of Japanese fiction, particularly the realistic novels that emerged in the later Edo period. The psychological insight, social observation, and frank treatment of sexual themes that characterized these stories provided models for later writers who were trying to depict contemporary life with honesty and complexity. The visual arts that emerged from the pleasure districts went far beyond Shunga to include portrait painting, architectural decoration, textile design, and decorative arts that served both aesthetic and commercial functions. The portraits of famous courtesans were collected like photographs of modern celebrities, creating a market for artistic representations that had nothing to do with sexual content. The decorative arts associated with courtesan culture included everything from hair ornaments and cosmetic containers to furniture and room dividers that demonstrated the wealth and taste of their owners while also serving practical functions. These objects often incorporated sexual symbolism in subtle ways that were immediately recognizable to informed viewers, but might be overlooked by others. The influence of this aesthetic tradition extended into the design of everyday objects throughout Japanese society. The color combinations, decorative motifs, and design principles developed in the pleasure districts appeared in ceramics, textiles, and architectural decoration that had no connection to sexual commerce, but reflected the broader influence of pleasure district aesthetics on Japanese visual culture. The philosophical implications of this aesthetic integration were profound. By incorporating sexual themes and pleasure district motifs into everyday design, Japanese culture was asserting that sexuality was a natural and acceptable part of human experience that didn't need to be hidden or separated from other aspects of life. This integration stands in sharp contrast to the aesthetic traditions of Christian societies, where sexual themes were largely excluded from respectable art and design. The Japanese approach created a visual environment where sexual awareness was constantly present, but was expressed through sophisticated artistic languages rather than crude or explicit imagery. The technological innovations that supported this cultural system were equally remarkable. The printing techniques that made mass distribution of Shunga possible were adapted for other forms of visual communication, contributing to the development of advertising, political propaganda, and educational materials that used similar visual strategies to communicate complex ideas quickly and effectively. The organizational systems that managed the complex economics of the pleasure districts provided models for other forms of commercial entertainment and service industries. The contracts, payment systems, and hierarchical management structures developed in the brothels influenced the organization of restaurants, theaters, and other businesses throughout Japanese society. The information networks that connected pleasure districts in different cities created some of the first systematic approaches to marketing and reputation management in Japanese commerce. The systems for tracking the fame and accomplishments of individual courtesans for coordinating prices and services across different establishments, and for managing the complex logistics of seasonal festivals and special events, provided templates for other industries. As we move deeper into this world, the complexity of emotions and relationships becomes even more apparent. The psychological landscape of Edo sexuality was far more nuanced than simple arrangements of power and pleasure. The letters and personal accounts that survive from this period reveal intense emotional bonds that developed within even the most commercialized relationships, suggesting that human connection found ways to flourish even in systems designed to commodify intimacy. The emotional complexity of these relationships defied the neat categories that modern observers might expect. A samurai warrior might develop genuine tenderness toward his Wakashudo apprentice, while simultaneously maintaining contractual obligations to his wife and commercial relationships with courtesans. Each relationship existed in its own emotional sphere, with its own rules, expectations, and forms of intimacy. Personal diaries from the period reveal men writing passionate poetry about their young male lovers, while also composing dutiful letters to their wives about household management and family obligations. These weren't contradictions in their minds, but different facets of a complete emotional life. The compartmentalization that seems strange to modern sensibilities was experienced as natural and necessary by people living within the system. The Wakashudo apprentices themselves occupied a unique position in this emotional landscape. They were simultaneously students, lovers, and future warriors, expected to absorb not just martial techniques, but emotional wisdom about loyalty, sacrifice, and the temporary nature of all relationships. The intensity of their bonds with older warriors was understood to be preparation for the equally intense but different relationships they would form throughout their lives. Contemporary accounts describe the ceremonies that marked the end of these relationships when the younger partner came of age. These weren't breakups in the modern sense, but ritualized transitions that acknowledged the changing nature of the bond while preserving its essential meaning. The former lovers became brothers in arms, bound by shared experience and mutual respect rather than physical intimacy. The psychological sophistication required to navigate these transitions was considerable. Young men had to learn how to transform sexual love into brotherly affection, while simultaneously beginning their own mentoring relationships with new apprentices. This created cycles of emotional education that passed down not just technical knowledge, but emotional wisdom about the nature of human attachment. The literature of the period suggests that this system produced men who were comfortable with emotional intensity and capable of forming deep bonds with both men and women throughout their lives. The samurai ideal wasn't emotional stoicism, but rather emotional flexibility, the ability to love deeply while accepting the impermanent nature of all relationships. Within the pleasure districts, similar emotional complexities developed between courtesans and their regular customers. While the basic framework was commercial, long-term relationships often evolved genuine emotional dimensions that went far beyond the original transaction. Some customers became protectors and confidants. Some courtesans became trusted advisors and companions. The most successful courtesans were those who could navigate these emotional complexities while maintaining clear boundaries about what was performance and what was genuine. They had to be skilled enough actresses to make every customer feel special and desired, while also being sophisticated enough psychologists to manage the emotional expectations and demands of men who might be paying enormous sums for the illusion of exclusive affection. The training that courtesans received included extensive instruction in emotional management, both their own and their customers. They learned how to read subtle emotional cues, how to provide the particular type of companionship each customer needed, and how to maintain professional boundaries while still creating satisfying, intimate experiences. The most accomplished courtesans became something like therapists, providing emotional services that went far beyond sexual gratification. They listened to their customers' problems, offered advice about family and business difficulties, and provided emotional support that many men couldn't find elsewhere in their rigidly structured lives. This therapeutic function wasn't officially recognized or discussed, but it was clearly understood by both courtesans and their customers. The privacy and confidentiality of the pleasure districts created spaces where men could express vulnerabilities and emotions that would be inappropriate or dangerous in other contexts. The architecture of the pleasure districts was designed to support these intimate emotional exchanges. Private rooms were small and carefully appointed to create atmospheres of warmth and security. The decoration, lighting, and acoustics were all calculated to encourage conversation and emotional openness, while maintaining the aesthetic sophistication that justified the high prices. Even the timing of visits was structured to allow for emotional as well as physical intimacy. The elaborate rituals surrounding interactions with high-level courtesans created extended periods for conversation, shared meals, and gradual emotional connection before any physical contact occurred. This pacing served multiple functions. It allowed courtesans to assess their customers and adjust their approach accordingly. It gave customers time to relax and shed the emotional armor required by their public roles. And it created the illusion, at least, that what was happening was about genuine attraction and compatibility rather than simple commercial transaction. The seasonal rhythms that governed these relationships added another layer of emotional complexity. Spring meetings had different emotional tones than autumn encounters. Summer festivals created opportunities for public display of affection that were impossible at other times. Winter gatherings were more intimate and introspective, focused on conversation and shared appreciation of carefully prepared food and drink. These seasonal variations meant that long-term relationships between courtesans and customers evolved through different emotional phases over the course of each year. Regular customers experienced their relationships as ongoing narratives, with chapters defined by changing seasons, festivals, and personal circumstances. The poetry that was exchanged in these relationships often tracked these seasonal changes, using natural imagery to express the evolution of feelings and the passage of time. A relationship that began with spring poems about cherry blossoms might develop through summer verses about cooling rivers and autumn reflections on the transience of beauty. The integration of poetry into these relationships served both practical and emotional functions. It provided a sophisticated language for expressing feelings that might be difficult to communicate directly. It demonstrated cultural education and aesthetic sensitivity, and it created lasting records of emotional experiences that could be treasured long after the relationships themselves had ended. The preservation of this poetry in personal collections and published anthologies gives us remarkable insight into the emotional lives of people participating in Edo's sexual culture. The verses reveal the full spectrum of human feeling, from passionate desire and tender affection to jealousy, disappointment, and grief. The seasonal festivals that punctuated the year provided structured opportunities for the expression of these emotions in public settings. During cherry blossom season, courtesans could leave their districts for outdoor gatherings where their relationships with regular customers could be displayed and celebrated. These occasions were eagerly anticipated by both parties as rare opportunities for public acknowledgement of bonds that were normally confined to private spaces. The summer festivals created different opportunities for emotional expression. The temporary suspension of normal social restrictions during certain celebrations allowed for public displays of affection and intimacy that would be scandalous at other times. These festivals served as safety valves, allowing the sexual energy of the cities to be expressed communally rather than being forced entirely into commercial or private channels. The autumn moon viewing parties were more contemplative occasions, focused on shared aesthetic appreciation and philosophical reflection. These gatherings often featured poetry competitions and musical performances that allowed courtesans and their customers to collaborate in artistic creation while celebrating their relationships. Winter brought more intimate celebrations, often centered around the appreciation of carefully prepared seasonal foods and the sharing of warmth during the coldest months. These gatherings emphasized the domestic and nurturing aspects of the relationships between courtesans and their regular customers. The emotional education that took place through these seasonal celebrations was considerable. Participants learned how to express and receive affection in culturally appropriate ways, how to appreciate aesthetic beauty as a shared experience, and how to find meaning in temporary relationships that were understood to be impermanent by their very nature. The Buddhist philosophical framework that influenced these relationships emphasized the importance of appreciating beauty and pleasure while they were available, without becoming so attached that their inevitable loss became a source of suffering. This created a distinctive emotional approach that combined intensity with detachment, passion with acceptance. The practical application of this philosophy was visible in how people managed the transitions that were built into the system. Wakashudo relationships were expected to evolve when the younger partner came of age. Relationships with courtesans were understood to be temporary, dependent on the customer's financial resources and the courtesan's availability. Marriages were primarily practical arrangements that might or might not develop emotional dimensions over time. Rather than seeing these limitations as tragic or frustrating, participants in Edo's sexual culture learned to find meaning and satisfaction within the constraints of each type of relationship. The temporary nature of most sexual relationships was seen as enhancing rather than diminishing their value, creating intensity and appreciation that might be impossible in permanent arrangements. The literary traditions that emerged from this culture celebrated the beauty of impermanent relationships rather than mourning their transience. The most admired stories and poems were often those that captured moments of perfect connection between lovers who knew their time together was limited. This aesthetic of impermanence influenced all aspects of Japanese culture, from the appreciation of cherry blossoms that bloom and fade within days, to the tea ceremony's emphasis on the unique and unrepeatable nature of each gathering. The sexual culture of the Edo period both reflected and reinforced these broader cultural values. The influence of this aesthetic approach extended into the visual arts that documented Edo's sexual culture. Shunga prints often depicted couples at moments of peak intimacy, capturing expressions of pleasure and connection that were understood to be fleeting. The artistic challenge was to represent the intensity of these moments, while also suggesting their transient nature. The techniques developed by Shunga artists for representing emotional states through facial expressions, body language, and compositional arrangements influenced all forms of Japanese visual art. The ability to capture subtle psychological states became a hallmark of Japanese artistic excellence that extended far beyond erotic subjects. The integration of emotional and physical representation in these artworks created visual languages for discussing sexuality that were both explicit and psychologically sophisticated. The prints served not just as arousal aids, but as educational materials that taught viewers how to recognize and appreciate the emotional dimensions of sexual experience. The distribution of these images throughout Japanese society meant that people across all social classes had access to sophisticated representations of sexual and emotional relationships. This visual education complemented the literary traditions and created a shared cultural vocabulary for understanding the psychological aspects of intimacy. The medical traditions that developed around Edo sexuality also reflected this integration of emotional and physical understanding. Japanese physicians wrote treatises that addressed not just the physical techniques of sexual performance, but also the emotional and psychological factors that contributed to satisfying relationships. These medical works recognized that sexual satisfaction depended on emotional as well as physical compatibility, and they provided guidance for managing the psychological challenges that could arise in different types of relationships. The physicians understood that the compartmentalization of sexual life into different categories required considerable emotional sophistication from all participants. The treatment of sexual problems in these medical texts reflected a holistic approach that considered the patient's entire emotional and social situation, rather than focusing solely on physical symptoms. This integrated approach was consistent with broader Japanese medical traditions that emphasized the interconnection of mind and body. The religious dimensions of Edo sexuality also reflected this integration of emotional and physical experience. The Buddhist concept of compassion was applied to sexual relationships, emphasizing the importance of considering the emotional needs and well-being of one's partners rather than focusing solely on personal gratification. The Shinto emphasis on harmony and natural order provided frameworks for understanding sexual relationships as part of the broader patterns that governed all aspects of life. This religious perspective helped legitimize the complex sexual arrangements of Edo society by placing them within cosmic rather than merely social contexts. The seasonal festivals associated with both Buddhist and Shinto traditions provided regular opportunities for the community celebration of sexuality as a natural and sacred part of human experience. These religious observances helped integrate sexual culture into the broader spiritual life of Japanese society. The philosophical traditions that influenced Edo sexuality emphasized personal responsibility and emotional maturity rather than external moral rules. Participants in sexual relationships were expected to understand and fulfill their obligations to their partners while also managing their own emotional needs and development. This emphasis on personal responsibility created a culture where sexual ethics were primarily about honesty, respect, and mutual benefit, rather than adherence to abstract moral principles. The question wasn't whether particular relationships were inherently good or bad, but whether the participants were treating each other with appropriate consideration and fulfilling their agreed-upon obligations. The educational systems that prepared young people for participation in this sexual culture emphasized the development of emotional intelligence and social sophistication, rather than simple rule-following. Both men and women needed to understand how to navigate complex relationship arrangements without causing unnecessary harm to themselves or others. The mentorship relationships that were central to samurai culture provided models for this type of education. Older warriors taught younger men not just martial techniques, but also emotional wisdom about managing relationships, understanding obligations, and finding satisfaction within social constraints. Similarly, the training systems in the pleasure districts provided extensive education in emotional management and social psychology. Courtesans and Geisha learned how to understand and respond to the emotional needs of their customers, while also protecting their own psychological well-being. The artistic traditions that documented this culture preserved not just the external forms of sexual relationships, but also the emotional wisdom that made them function successfully. The literature, visual arts, and performing arts that emerged from Edo's sexual culture provided ongoing education for each new generation about how to participate in these complex social arrangements. The economic systems that supported this culture also reflected its emotional sophistication. The pricing structures in the pleasure districts weren't based solely on physical services, but took into account the emotional labor required to provide satisfying, intimate experiences. The most expensive courtesans were those who could provide the most sophisticated emotional as well as physical companionship. The seasonal variations in pricing reflected the different emotional demands of different times of year. Spring visits, with their emphasis on renewal and possibility, required different emotional skills than autumn encounters focused on reflection and acceptance. The pricing structures acknowledged these variations and compensated courtesans accordingly. The long-term financial arrangements between regular customers and their preferred courtesans often resembled emotional support contracts as much as sexual service agreements. Customers paid not just for individual encounters, but for ongoing access to emotional intimacy and companionship that might extend over many years. The retirement and career transition systems in the pleasure districts also reflected the emotional dimensions of the work. Successful courtesans who accumulated enough wealth to leave prostitution often established businesses that continued to provide emotional services, such as tea houses where men could find sophisticated conversation and companionship without explicit sexual content. The social networks that connected former courtesans, retired geisha, and their long-time customers created ongoing communities that preserved the emotional bonds that had developed within the commercial sexual system. These networks provided social support and continuity that extended far beyond the original business relationships. The influence of these emotional traditions extended into the broader development of Japanese social customs around hospitality, entertainment, and business relationships. The skills developed in the pleasure districts for creating intimate atmospheres, managing complex social dynamics, and providing sophisticated emotional services became part of Japanese cultural expertise that influenced many other aspects of society. The psychological insights that emerged from this culture contributed to Japanese understanding of human nature and social relationships that can still be seen in contemporary Japanese approaches to therapy, education, and social organization. The recognition that different types of relationships serve different emotional functions and that successful intimate relationships require both emotional intelligence and social sophistication remains part of Japanese cultural wisdom. The documentation of this emotional complexity in the art and literature of the Edo period provides us with unusually detailed insight into the psychological dimensions of pre-modern sexuality. Most historical cultures left behind much less information about the emotional aspects of sexual relationships, making the Japanese record particularly valuable for understanding how sexuality functioned in societies with very different values and social arrangements than our own. As we continue to explore this world, the integration of sexuality into every aspect of daily life becomes even more apparent. The boundaries between public and private, sacred and profane, commercial and personal were drawn in ways that created a remarkably open and psychologically sophisticated sexual culture that influenced Japanese society for centuries to come. The legacy of this period continues to influence Japanese culture today, creating attitudes towards sexuality, relationships, and emotional expression that differ significantly from those found in societies shaped by Christian traditions. Understanding this historical foundation helps explain many aspects of contemporary Japanese culture that might otherwise seem puzzling or contradictory to outside observers. The documentation of this sexual culture in art, literature, and personal accounts provides us with an unusually complete picture of how sexuality functioned in a pre-modern society that had very different values and social arrangements than those familiar to most contemporary readers. This historical record offers insights into alternative ways of organizing sexual relationships that remain relevant to ongoing discussions about sexuality, gender, and social organization. The documentation becomes even more fascinating when we examine the daily rhythms that governed these relationships. Unlike modern arrangements where sexuality might be compartmentalized into private moments, Edo period intimacy was woven throughout the fabric of everyday existence in ways that would seem extraordinary today. Consider the morning routine of a wealthy merchant in 1720s Edo. He might wake beside his wife, share a formal breakfast that emphasized family duty and household management, then spend his afternoon visiting a young male apprentice at a nearby dojo, discussing business while their relationship carried undertones of mentorship and desire. By evening, he could be found at a tea house in Yoshiwara, engaging in elaborate courtship rituals, with a courtesan whose education in poetry and music far exceeded that of most men of his social class. None of these relationships competed with each other in his mind. Each served distinct purposes in his emotional and social landscape. His wife provided family continuity and social respectability. His relationship with the young man offered the intensity and mutual education that Wakashudo traditions celebrated. The courtesan provided sophisticated cultural companionship and sexual pleasure that was understood to be entirely separate from his other obligations. This compartmentalization required remarkable emotional sophistication from everyone involved. The wife understood that her husband's outside relationships actually protected the stability of their marriage by providing outlets for desires and needs that weren't meant to be fulfilled within the domestic sphere. The apprentice learned about loyalty and honor through intimate bonds that would eventually transform into lifelong brotherhood. The courtesan navigated the complex challenge of providing genuine companionship within a commercial framework. The physical spaces of Edo were designed to support these multiple relationship systems. Different districts served different functions. The castle areas housed the formal marriages and family obligations of the samurai class. The merchant quarters buzzed with the mentor relationships that combined business training with personal intimacy. The pleasure districts provided elaborate stages for the performance of desire and cultural sophistication. Even the architecture within each space reflected its sexual function. Samurai residences included separate wings for wives and for the entertainment of male guests, with carefully designed sightlines that allowed for both privacy and subtle observation. The buildings where Wakashudo relationships flourished featured training halls that doubled as spaces for intimate conversation, with alcoves and gardens that provided settings for the emotional bonding that accompanied martial instruction. The tea houses and brothels of the pleasure districts were perhaps the most architecturally sophisticated, with rooms that could be reconfigured for different types of encounters, elaborate gardens visible through carefully placed windows, and acoustic designs that allowed for both intimate conversation and the subtle monitoring that ensured customer safety and courtesan compliance with house rules. The seasonal transformations of these spaces were equally important. Spring brought cherry blossom decorations that emphasized renewal and the temporary nature of beauty. Summer arrangements focused on cooling elements and the celebration of physical pleasure. Autumn decorations highlighted the philosophical appreciation of impermanence, while winter settings emphasized intimacy and the sharing of warmth during the coldest months. The clothing worn in each context carried complex messages about the nature of the relationships being conducted. Samurai formal wear emphasized hierarchy and duty when men were with their wives, but shifted to more relaxed styles that suggested mentorship and affection when they were with their apprentices. In the pleasure districts, the elaborate costumes worn by courtesans weren't just beautiful displays, but sophisticated communication systems that conveyed information about their status, availability, seasonal awareness, and cultural sophistication. The most successful participants in this culture became skilled at reading these visual languages and responding appropriately. A man who appeared at a high-level tea house wearing inappropriate seasonal colors or failing to match his accessories to the formality level expected would be quietly directed to less prestigious establishments. The courtesans themselves were evaluated partly on their ability to present themselves with perfect aesthetic appropriateness for each encounter. The music that accompanied these various relationship contexts was equally specialized and meaningful. Different instruments and vocal styles were associated with different types of intimacy. The shamisen and koto that provided soundtracks for courtesan entertainment required different emotional responses than the flutes and drums that accompanied samurai gatherings. Even the silence that was cultivated in certain intimate settings was understood as a form of communication that required skill to interpret and respond to appropriately. The food and drink consumed in different relationship contexts carried similar symbolic weight. The formal meals shared between husbands and wives emphasized seasonal propriety and family tradition. The sake consumed during Wakashudo bonding rituals was chosen to enhance conversation and emotional openness without compromising the dignity required for martial training. The elaborate kaizeki meals that accompanied high-level courtesan entertainment were designed to demonstrate aesthetic sophistication and to provide structured activities that allowed relationships to develop gradually over extended periods. The timing of these various relationships followed complex schedules that reflected both practical necessities and cultural meanings. Certain times of day were considered more appropriate for different types of intimacy. Morning encounters emphasized fresh beginnings and renewal. Afternoon meetings were associated with practical learning and mentorship. Evening gatherings focused on pleasure and aesthetic appreciation. Late night and early morning hours were reserved for the most intimate and emotionally intense encounters. The lunar calendar that governed Japanese cultural life added another layer of complexity to these timing considerations. Different phases of the moon were associated with different types of emotional and sexual energy. Full moon periods were considered especially auspicious for the beginning of new relationships, while the dark of the moon was thought to be appropriate for the deepest and most transformative intimate experiences. The annual cycle of festivals provided regular opportunities for the public celebration of these normally private relationship systems. During certain festivals, the usual social restrictions were temporarily suspended, allowing for public displays of affection between men and their Wakashudo partners, or for courtesans to appear in public settings alongside their regular customers. These festival occasions served important social functions beyond simple entertainment. They provided opportunities for the community to witness and validate relationship bonds that were normally hidden from public view. They allowed younger people to observe and learn about the relationship systems they would eventually participate in themselves. And they created safety valves that prevented the pressure of maintaining multiple complex relationships from becoming psychologically unbearable. The poetry competitions that were central to many of these festivals created structured environments where the emotional and intellectual dimensions of these relationships could be publicly displayed and celebrated. The verses composed during these events often became treasured keepsakes that preserved the memory of particular relationships long after they had ended or transformed. The gambling and games that were popular during festival periods provided additional frameworks for intimate interaction. The competitive elements added excitement and emotional intensity to encounters that might otherwise become routine. The winning and losing of games created opportunities for the display of grace under pressure and the offering of comfort to disappointed partners. The theatrical performances that accompanied many festivals provided shared cultural experiences that deepened the bonds between intimate partners. The stories performed often dealt with themes of love, loyalty, sacrifice, and the challenges of maintaining relationships within complex social systems. Watching these performances together allowed couples to explore emotional territories that might be difficult to discuss directly. The craft demonstrations and teaching exhibitions that were featured during festivals provided opportunities for mentors to display their skills and for apprentices to show their progress in front of appreciative audiences. These public demonstrations served to validate the educational dimensions of Wakashudo relationships, while also providing entertainment for the broader community. The religious ceremonies that were integrated into festival celebrations provided spiritual frameworks for understanding intimate relationships as part of the larger cosmic order. The blessing of couples, the purification rituals that marked relationship transitions, and the offerings made for the success of ongoing partnerships all helped integrate sexuality into the broader spiritual life of Japanese society. The economic activities that surrounded festivals created opportunities for intimate partners to demonstrate their care for each other through gift-giving, shared purchases, and collaborative participation in the festival economy. The selection and exchange of gifts required intimate knowledge of partners' preferences and needs, while the shared experience of festival shopping created memories that could be treasured long after the events themselves. The travel that was often associated with festival attendance provided opportunities for intimate partners to spend extended time together outside their normal social contexts. These journeys allowed relationships to develop in new directions, while also providing adventure and variety that helped prevent the complex relationship systems from becoming stale or burdensome. The documentation of festival experiences in diaries, letters, and artistic works created lasting records of intimate relationships that provide us with detailed insights into the emotional dimensions of Edo sexuality. The accounts of festival attendance reveal the excitement, joy, and satisfaction that people found in their complex relationship arrangements, while also acknowledging the challenges and difficulties that such systems inevitably created. The influence of festival culture on the broader development of Japanese approaches to sexuality and relationships was profound and lasting. The integration of celebration, competition, artistic creation, and intimate bonding that characterized these events established patterns that continued to influence Japanese culture long after the specific social systems that created them had disappeared. The educational functions of festivals were particularly important for the transmission of sexual culture from one generation to the next. Young people learned not just the practical skills needed to participate in complex relationship systems, but also the emotional attitudes and philosophical frameworks that made such participation psychologically sustainable and socially beneficial. The artistic innovations that emerged from festival culture influenced the broader development of Japanese aesthetic traditions in ways that extended far beyond sexuality. The integration of visual, musical, literary, and performative elements that characterize festival entertainment established principles of artistic collaboration and multimedia presentation that became central to Japanese cultural production. The social networks that were created and maintained through festival participation provided support systems that helped individuals navigate the challenges of maintaining multiple intimate relationships. The friendships and alliances formed during festivals often proved crucial for managing the practical and emotional difficulties that such complex social arrangements inevitably generated. The economic impact of festival culture extended throughout Japanese society, creating markets for specialized goods and services, while also providing employment opportunities for artists, craftspeople, and service providers. The festival economy helped support the broader cultural infrastructure that made Edo's sophisticated sexual culture possible. The technological innovations that were developed to support festival activities influenced broader Japanese approaches to engineering, logistics, and event management. The organizational skills required to coordinate complex festival programs provided models for other forms of social coordination that had applications far beyond the world of sexuality and entertainment. The diplomatic functions of festivals were also significant, providing neutral ground where people from different social classes, regions, and occupational groups could interact in relatively informal settings. These interactions helped maintain social cohesion despite the rigid hierarchies that governed most aspects of daily life in Edo society. The therapeutic dimensions of festival culture provided outlets for emotional expression and stress relief that helped prevent the psychological pressures of complex relationship management from becoming overwhelming. The temporary suspension of normal social restrictions during festivals allowed people to experience freedom and spontaneity that was otherwise largely absent from their highly regulated lives. The philosophical implications of festival culture were equally important, providing regular reminders that pleasure, beauty, and intimate connection were valuable aspects of human experience that deserved celebration and protection. The integration of sexuality into community celebration helped legitimize desires and relationships that might otherwise be seen as purely private or potentially antisocial. The international dimensions of festival culture were also noteworthy, as foreign visitors to Japan often commented on the openness and sophistication of Japanese approaches to sexuality and celebration. These observations influenced broader cultural exchanges and contributed to Japan's reputation as a society with distinctly different approaches to intimate relationships. The seasonal variations in festival culture provided regular rhythms of anticipation, celebration, and reflection that helped structure the emotional lives of people participating in complex relationship systems. The knowledge that certain types of celebration and intimacy would be possible at predictable times helped sustain people through periods when normal social restrictions were more constraining. The generational aspects of festival culture were particularly important for maintaining continuity in sexual traditions, while also allowing for innovation and change. Older participants served as teachers and guides for younger people, while younger participants brought energy and new perspectives that helped prevent traditions from becoming stale or overly rigid. The gender dynamics of festival culture provided some of the few contexts where women could exercise agency and creativity within the constraints of a male-dominated social system. While women's options remained limited, festivals provided opportunities for artistic expression, social interaction, and the development of relationships that offered alternatives to purely domestic or commercial roles. The regional variations in festival culture reflected the diversity of Japanese society, while also providing mechanisms for cultural exchange and integration. Different regions developed distinctive approaches to celebrating sexuality and relationships, but the travel and communication associated with major festivals helped spread innovations and maintain connections across geographic boundaries. The urban-rural connections that were facilitated by festival culture helped integrate the sophisticated sexual practices of city life with the more traditional relationship patterns of agricultural communities. These connections prevented urban and rural sexual cultures from diverging completely, while also providing pathways for the gradual spread of new ideas and practices. The class dynamics of festival culture were complex, providing some opportunities for social mobility while also reinforcing existing hierarchies. Talented performers or particularly skilled courtesans might use festival appearances to attract more prestigious customers or patrons, while wealthy participants could use festivals to display their cultural sophistication and social status. The religious dimensions of festival culture helped integrate sexuality into broader spiritual frameworks that provided meaning and legitimacy for intimate relationships. The blessing of relationships during religious festivals and the incorporation of sexual symbolism into religious observances helped prevent sexuality from being seen as purely secular or potentially corrupt. The artistic legacy of festival culture influenced Japanese aesthetic traditions for centuries, establishing principles of beauty, harmony, and emotional expression that continued to shape cultural production long after the specific social systems that created them had disappeared. The integration of sexuality into artistic expression that was central to festival culture helped establish Japan's distinctive approach to erotic art and literature. The psychological insights that emerged from festival culture contributed to Japanese understanding of human nature and social relationships in ways that remain relevant today. The recognition that celebration, competition, and intimate bonding could be successfully combined provided models for thinking about human relationships that differed significantly from approaches developed in other cultural traditions. The documentation of festival culture in contemporary accounts, artistic works, and personal records provides us with extraordinarily detailed information about how sexuality functioned in a pre-modern society. This documentation is particularly valuable because it captures not just the formal structures of sexual relationships, but also the lived experiences of people participating in those relationships. The influence of festival culture on the broader development of Japanese social customs extended far beyond sexuality, to include approaches to hospitality, entertainment, and community organization that shaped Japanese society for centuries. The skills developed for creating successful festivals provided models for organizing other types of social activities and managing complex group dynamics. The environmental aspects of festival culture were also significant, as the seasonal timing of celebrations helped maintain connections between human sexuality and natural cycles. This integration of human desire with natural rhythms provided philosophical frameworks for understanding sexuality as part of the larger order of existence rather than as something separate from or opposed to nature. The technological legacy of festival culture included innovations in lighting, sound management, crowd control, and event coordination that influenced broader Japanese approaches to engineering and logistics. The challenges of managing large-scale public celebrations led to developments that had applications in many other areas of social organization. The economic theories that emerged from festival culture influenced Japanese approaches to commerce, pricing, and market organization in ways that extended far beyond the entertainment industry. The complex relationship between artistic value, social status, and commercial pricing that characterized festival economies provided models for thinking about value and exchange that influenced broader economic development. The legal frameworks that developed around festival culture established precedents for regulating entertainment, managing public gatherings, and balancing individual desires with community interests. These legal innovations influenced broader Japanese approaches to law and social regulation in ways that had lasting impact on Japanese society. The international reputation that Japanese festival culture developed influenced foreign perceptions of Japanese society and contributed to cultural exchanges that shaped Japan's relationships with other countries. The sophistication and openness of Japanese approaches to celebrating sexuality became part of Japan's cultural identity in the eyes of foreign observers. The educational innovations that emerged from festival culture provided models for teaching and learning that influenced Japanese approaches to education in many different fields. The integration of artistic, intellectual, and emotional learning that characterized festival education established principles that continued to influence Japanese educational philosophy long after the specific social systems that created them had changed. The medical innovations that emerged from this cultural environment were equally remarkable, reflecting the integration of sexual knowledge with broader approaches to health and healing. Japanese physicians of the Edo period developed sophisticated understanding of sexual physiology that went far beyond the crude anatomical knowledge available in most other societies of the time. These medical practitioners recognized that sexual satisfaction depended on both physical and emotional factors, leading them to develop treatment approaches that addressed the whole person rather than focusing solely on mechanical function. Their treatises discussed the importance of mental preparation, emotional compatibility, and seasonal timing in achieving satisfying intimate relationships. The physicians also understood that the complex relationship systems of their society created unique psychological pressures that required specialized therapeutic approaches. They developed techniques for helping people manage the emotional challenges of maintaining multiple intimate relationships while fulfilling their various social obligations. The medical literature of the period reveals remarkably frank discussions of sexual problems and their solutions. These texts addressed everything from basic anatomical education to complex psychological issues, providing practical guidance for people navigating the intricate sexual culture of their time. The integration of sexual health into broader medical practice meant that Japanese physicians developed unusually comprehensive approaches to treating their patients. They understood that sexual problems often reflected broader health issues, while physical ailments frequently had sexual dimensions that needed to be addressed for complete healing. The herbal traditions that supported this medical approach included extensive knowledge of plants and preparations that could enhance sexual pleasure, prevent unwanted pregnancy, and treat sexually transmitted infections. This botanical expertise was passed down through both formal medical training and informal networks of healers and courtesans. The diagnostic techniques used by these physicians included careful attention to subtle signs of sexual dissatisfaction or dysfunction that might indicate broader health problems. They understood that changes in sexual appetite or performance often provided early warnings of developing medical conditions. The treatment protocols that emerged from this integrated approach combined physical remedies with psychological counseling and lifestyle recommendations. Patients received guidance not just on herbal preparations or physical techniques, but on managing their relationships and emotional states to support their overall sexual health. The preventive medicine approaches that developed around sexual health emphasized the importance of maintaining balance in all aspects of life. Physicians taught that excessive indulgence was as dangerous as complete abstinence, and that healthy sexuality required attention to diet, exercise, sleep, and emotional well-being. The seasonal timing recommendations that were central to this medical tradition reflected deep understanding of how natural cycles affected human sexuality. Physicians provided detailed guidance on when different types of intimate activities were most beneficial and when restraint was advisable for health reasons. The social medicine aspects of this tradition addressed the community health implications of sexual practices. Physicians understood that the health of individuals was connected to the health of their intimate networks, leading them to consider relationship dynamics when diagnosing and treating sexual problems. The educational dimensions of medical practice included extensive instruction for both patients and their partners. Physicians understood that successful treatment often required changes in behavior from multiple people, not just the individual seeking help. The documentation of medical knowledge in detailed treatises and case studies created a body of literature that preserved sophisticated understanding of sexual health for future generations. These texts provide us with remarkable insights into how pre-modern societies could develop advanced knowledge without access to modern scientific methods. The influence of this medical tradition extended beyond sexuality to shape broader Japanese approaches to health and healing. The holistic perspective that characterized sexual medicine influenced general medical practice in ways that distinguished Japanese healing traditions from those that developed in other cultures. The training systems that prepared physicians to address sexual health issues were comprehensive and demanding. Medical students learned not just anatomical and physiological knowledge, but also the interpersonal skills needed to discuss intimate matters with patients from different social classes and backgrounds. The ethical frameworks that govern medical practice in this area emphasize the physician's responsibility to maintain confidentiality while also ensuring that treatment recommendations serve both individual and community well-being. These ethical considerations were particularly complex given the intricate social relationships that characterized Edo sexuality. The technological innovations that supported medical practice included the development of specialized instruments and preparation techniques that enhance the effectiveness of sexual health treatments. These innovations reflected the high level of craftsmanship and technical sophistication that characterized Japanese material culture. The international dimensions of medical knowledge included awareness of healing traditions from China, Korea, and other neighboring cultures. Japanese physicians adapted and integrated foreign knowledge while also developing distinctively Japanese approaches that reflected their unique social and cultural circumstances. The gender aspects of medical practice were particularly complex, as physicians had to navigate the different social roles and expectations that governed men's and women's sexuality. The treatment approaches developed for different genders reflected both biological differences and social constraints that affected how sexual problems could be addressed. The class considerations that influenced medical practice reflected the broader social hierarchies that governed Edo society. Physicians developed different treatment approaches for patients from different social classes, recognizing that the relationship systems and social pressures varied significantly across the social spectrum. The economic aspects of medical practice created markets for specialized knowledge and treatments that supported a complex network of healers, herbalists, and other practitioners. The demand for sexual health services generated significant economic activity while also providing incentives for continued innovation and knowledge development. The religious dimensions of medical practice required physicians to integrate their scientific knowledge with the spiritual frameworks that provided meaning and context for their patients' intimate relationships. This integration created treatment approaches that addressed both physical and spiritual aspects of sexual health. The philosophical implications of medical practice in this area contributed to broader Japanese understanding of the relationship between mind and body, individual and community, natural and cultural forces. These insights influenced not just medical practice, but also broader intellectual development. The documentation of medical knowledge in artistic as well as textual forms created visual languages for discussing sexual health that complemented the written tradition. The integration of medical knowledge with artistic expression helped make complex information accessible to people with different levels of literacy and education. The seasonal variations in medical practice reflected the understanding that human sexuality was connected to natural cycles and that treatment approaches needed to be adjusted accordingly. This seasonal awareness created medical traditions that were closely integrated with broader cultural practices around timing and natural harmony. The preventive aspects of medical practice emphasized education and lifestyle management as alternatives to treating problems after they developed. This preventive approach required physicians to understand not just individual physiology, but also the social and cultural factors that contributed to sexual health or dysfunction. The therapeutic relationships that developed between physicians and patients often extended over many years, allowing for ongoing monitoring and adjustment of treatment approaches. These long-term relationships provided opportunities for detailed observation of how sexual health changed over the life cycle. The community health dimensions of medical practice required physicians to consider how individual treatment decisions might affect broader social networks. This community perspective influenced treatment recommendations and created additional ethical responsibilities for medical practitioners. The innovation cycles that characterized medical development in this area reflected the dynamic interaction between practical experience, theoretical knowledge, and cultural change. New understanding emerged from the ongoing interaction between healers, patients, and the broader community of people engaged with sexual culture. The quality control mechanisms that ensured effective medical practice included informal networks of practitioners who shared knowledge and monitored each other's work. These professional communities provided support and accountability, while also facilitating the spread of innovations and best practices. The adaptation mechanisms that allowed medical practice to respond to changing social conditions were particularly important during periods of rapid cultural change. Physicians had to continuously update their understanding and treatment approaches as the social systems that shape sexuality evolved. The preservation systems that maintained medical knowledge across generations included both formal training programs and informal apprenticeship relationships. The complexity of sexual medicine required extensive mentorship and hands-on experience that could not be acquired through books alone. The integration systems that connected sexual medicine with other areas of medical practice created comprehensive approaches to health that recognized the connections between sexuality and overall well-being. This integration distinguished Japanese medical traditions from those that compartmentalized different aspects of health. The validation systems that confirmed the effectiveness of medical treatments included both individual case studies and broader community observation. The success of sexual medicine was measured not just by individual outcomes, but by its contribution to broader social health and stability. The communication systems that allowed medical knowledge to spread throughout society included both formal publications and informal networks of practitioners and patients. These communication channels ensured that medical innovations could reach people who needed them, while also maintaining appropriate levels of discretion and privacy. The feedback systems that allowed medical practice to improve based on experience created cycles of continuous development and refinement. The complexity of sexual health issues required ongoing learning and adaptation that could only come from careful attention to treatment outcomes and patient responses. The support systems that helped patients implement medical recommendations recognized that sexual health often required changes in lifestyle, relationships, and social circumstances that went far beyond simple medical compliance. These support systems provided the broader community assistance needed for successful treatment. The monitoring systems that tracked the long-term effects of medical interventions were particularly important in sexual medicine, where the consequences of treatment decisions might not become apparent for years. These monitoring systems required sustained observation and careful record-keeping that demonstrated the sophistication of Japanese medical practice. The coordination systems that integrated sexual medicine with other social institutions ensured that medical recommendations were compatible with religious, legal, and cultural requirements. This coordination was essential for maintaining social harmony while also addressing individual health needs. The evolution systems that allowed medical knowledge to develop and change over time created traditions that were both stable and adaptive. The ability to maintain core insights while also incorporating new understanding was crucial for the long-term effectiveness of sexual medicine in a changing society. As we explore these intricate medical traditions, we begin to understand how deeply sexuality was woven into every aspect of Japanese society during this period. The physicians who specialized in sexual health weren't treating isolated problems, but were participating in the maintenance of a complex cultural system that required sophisticated knowledge and careful attention to maintain successfully. The patients who sought this specialized medical care were navigating relationship systems that demanded physical stamina, emotional resilience, and social sophistication that went far beyond what most modern people would consider normal or manageable. The medical support that made such systems possible represented a remarkable achievement in both scientific knowledge and social organization. The broader implications of this medical tradition extended throughout Japanese society, influencing everything from architectural design and seasonal planning to educational philosophy and artistic expression. The understanding that sexual health was connected to all other aspects of human well-being created approaches to medicine that were uniquely comprehensive and culturally integrated. The legacy of these medical traditions continued to influence Japanese approaches to health and healing long after the specific social systems they supported had disappeared. The holistic perspective, the attention to emotional as well as physical factors, and the integration of individual and community health considerations became lasting features of Japanese medical culture. The documentation of these medical traditions provides us with extraordinary insights into how pre-modern societies could develop sophisticated knowledge about human sexuality and create social systems that supported complex, intimate relationships. This historical record remains relevant for contemporary discussions about sexuality, health, and the relationship between individual and community well-being. The artistic traditions that emerged alongside these medical developments created visual and literary languages for discussing sexual health that were both educational and aesthetically sophisticated. The integration of medical knowledge with artistic expression helped make complex information accessible, while also contributing to the broader cultural celebration of sexuality as a natural and important aspect of human experience. The philosophical frameworks that supported these medical traditions contributed to Japanese understanding of the relationship between nature and culture, individual desire and social obligation, temporary pleasure and lasting well-being. These philosophical insights influenced not just medical practice, but also broader intellectual and cultural development that shaped Japanese society for centuries. The technological innovations that supported sexual medicine included not just herbal preparations and treatment techniques, but also the organizational systems that made specialized knowledge available to people who needed it. These technological developments reflected the high level of social organization and cultural sophistication that characterized Edo society. The international connections that influenced Japanese sexual medicine included knowledge from Chinese, Korean, and other Asian medical traditions, but also the development of distinctively Japanese approaches that reflected unique cultural circumstances and social systems. This combination of international influence and local innovation created medical traditions that were both cosmopolitan and distinctively Japanese. The economic systems that supported sexual medicine created markets for specialized knowledge and services, while also ensuring that basic sexual health information was available to people across the social spectrum. The balance between commercial and community provision of medical services reflected broader Japanese approaches to managing the relationship between individual and collective needs. The educational systems that transmitted medical knowledge included both formal training programs and informal networks of practitioners and patients. The complexity of sexual medicine required extensive education that combined theoretical knowledge with practical experience and cultural understanding. The quality assurance systems that maintained standards in sexual medicine included professional oversight, patient feedback, and community monitoring that ensured effective treatment while also maintaining appropriate discretion and privacy. These quality systems reflected the high standards that Japanese society maintained for all aspects of cultural and professional life. The innovation systems that drove continued development in sexual medicine included both individual research and collaborative knowledge sharing that created ongoing improvements in understanding and treatment approaches. The dynamic nature of these innovation systems reflected the broader Japanese commitment to continuous improvement and refinement in all areas of cultural activity. The preservation systems that maintained this sophisticated knowledge across generations were as complex as the knowledge itself. Master physicians trained apprentices not just in technical skills, but in the subtle arts of observation and discretion that sexual medicine required. These training relationships often lasted decades, with students gradually taking on more complex cases as their understanding deepened. The apprentice system created chains of knowledge transmission that preserved not just medical facts, but the cultural wisdom needed to apply that knowledge appropriately. A physician treating a samurai's relationship difficulties needed different approaches than one helping a merchant's wife or addressing problems in the pleasure districts. This cultural competency couldn't be learned from books alone. Record-keeping in sexual medicine was particularly sophisticated, though necessarily discreet. Physicians developed coded languages for documenting sensitive cases, using seasonal metaphors and literary references that would be meaningless to casual observers, but perfectly clear to trained practitioners. These records allowed for long-term tracking of treatment outcomes and the development of increasingly refined therapeutic approaches. The case studies that accumulated over centuries provided invaluable insights into how different types of sexual relationships affected health over time. Physicians could observe patterns that connected specific relationship arrangements with particular health outcomes, leading to increasingly sophisticated understanding of the connections between intimate life and overall well-being. The seasonal timing that governed so many aspects of Edo sexuality was particularly important in medical practice. Physicians understood that the body's sexual responses varied with the seasons, and they adjusted their treatment recommendations accordingly. Spring treatments emphasized renewal and the beginning of new relationship cycles. Summer approaches focused on managing the increased sexual energy that warm weather brought. Autumn therapies helped patients prepare for the more introspective, intimate experiences of winter, while winter treatments addressed the challenges of maintaining sexual health during the coldest and most demanding months. These seasonal variations weren't just theoretical concepts, but practical approaches that physicians had observed to be more effective when properly timed. The integration of medical treatment with natural cycles reflected the broader Japanese understanding that human sexuality was part of the natural order rather than something separate from or opposed to nature. The dietary recommendations that were central to sexual medicine revealed deep understanding of how nutrition affected intimate relationships. Physicians prescribed specific foods for different types of sexual problems, understanding that what people ate influenced not just their physical capacity, but their emotional states and social compatibility. Spring diets emphasized fresh vegetables and light proteins that supported the renewed energy of the season. Summer foods were chosen to provide sustained energy without overheating the body during the warmest months. Autumn nutrition focused on building reserves for winter, while also supporting the deeper emotional work that characterized intimate relationships during that season. Winter diets were designed to maintain warmth and energy during the most challenging months, while also supporting the intensive indoor intimacy that cold weather encouraged. The herbal traditions that supported these dietary approaches included extensive knowledge of plants that could enhance different aspects of sexual experience. Some herbs improved physical stamina and responsiveness. Others supported emotional balance and compatibility. Still others were used to prevent unwanted pregnancies or treat sexually transmitted infections. The preparation techniques for these herbal remedies were closely guarded secrets passed down through master-apprentice relationships. The timing of harvest, the methods of drying and storage, the proper combinations and proportions, all required detailed knowledge that took years to master. Some preparations required months of careful processing before they were ready for use. The administration of these remedies was equally complex, involving not just the right dosages, but proper timing relative to meals, seasons, and intimate activities. Patients received detailed instructions that covered not just when and how to take their medicines, but how to modify their lifestyles to support the treatment's effectiveness. The diagnostic techniques that guided these treatments were remarkably sophisticated for their time. Physicians examined not just obvious physical symptoms, but subtle signs that revealed the state of patients' intimate relationships and overall sexual health. Changes in skin tone, voice quality, posture, and emotional expression all provided information about sexual well-being. The examination process itself required considerable skill and discretion. Patients needed to feel comfortable discussing the most private aspects of their lives, while physicians had to gather detailed information without crossing social boundaries or causing embarrassment. The development of appropriate examination techniques required years of training and experience. The treatment protocols that emerged from these examinations were individually tailored to each patient's specific circumstances. No two people received identical treatments, even when they presented with similar symptoms. Physicians understood that sexual health problems always occurred within unique combinations of physical, emotional, and social factors that required individualized approaches. The follow-up care that ensured successful treatment outcomes involved regular monitoring and adjustment of therapeutic approaches. Sexual health problems rarely resolved quickly, and physicians expected to work with patients over extended periods, modifying treatments as circumstances changed and understanding deepened. The integration of family members and intimate partners into treatment plans reflected understanding that sexual health problems affected entire relationship networks. Successful treatment often required changes in behavior from multiple people, not just the individual seeking help. This system's approach to treatment was remarkably advanced for its time. The confidentiality protocols that protected patient privacy were essential given the sensitive nature of sexual medicine. Physicians developed elaborate safeguards to ensure that information about patients' intimate lives couldn't be used against them socially or politically. These confidentiality systems were particularly important given the complex social hierarchies that governed Edo society. The professional networks that connected sexual medicine practitioners created informal systems of consultation and knowledge sharing that improved treatment outcomes while maintaining appropriate discretion. Physicians could discuss difficult cases with colleagues without revealing patient identities, leading to better care for everyone. The research methods that advanced understanding in sexual medicine included careful observation of treatment outcomes, systematic comparison of different therapeutic approaches, and ongoing refinement of diagnostic and treatment techniques. This research was necessarily informal and private, but it was systematic and scientifically sound within the limitations of the time. The theoretical frameworks that guided medical practice drew from multiple traditions, including Chinese medicine, Buddhist philosophy, and distinctively Japanese approaches to understanding human nature and social relationships. The integration of these different knowledge systems created comprehensive approaches to sexual health that addressed both individual and community well-being. The validation systems that confirmed the effectiveness of treatments included not just individual patient outcomes, but broader community health indicators. The success of sexual medicine was measured partly by its contribution to social stability and the maintenance of the complex relationship systems that characterized Edo society. The innovation cycles that drove continued development in sexual medicine were closely connected to broader cultural changes. As social systems evolved and new relationship patterns emerged, physicians had to adapt their understanding and treatment approaches accordingly. This created dynamic traditions that could respond to changing circumstances while maintaining core insights. The teaching methods that transmitted sexual medicine knowledge were carefully adapted to the sensitive nature of the subject matter. Students learned through graduated exposure to increasingly complex cases, with extensive mentorship and supervision to ensure they developed appropriate professional attitudes and skills. The ethical frameworks that governed sexual medicine practice were particularly complex, given the intersection of individual health needs with social obligations and cultural expectations. Physicians had to balance their responsibilities to individual patients with broader community interests, often navigating conflicting demands with considerable skill. The quality control mechanisms that maintained standards in sexual medicine included peer review, patient feedback, and community oversight that ensured effective treatment while protecting professional reputations and patient privacy. These systems reflected the high standards that Japanese society maintained for professional practice in all areas. The technological innovations that supported sexual medicine included not just herbal preparations and treatment techniques, but also the communication and organizational systems that made specialized knowledge available when and where it was needed. These technologies were often ingeniously simple but remarkably effective. The economic structures that supported sexual medicine created sustainable markets for specialized knowledge and services, while ensuring that basic sexual health information was available across the social spectrum. The balance between commercial and charitable provision of medical services reflected broader Japanese approaches to managing essential community needs. The international connections that influenced Japanese sexual medicine included awareness of medical traditions from throughout Asia, but also the development of distinctively Japanese approaches that reflected unique cultural circumstances. This combination of international learning and local innovation created medical traditions that were both cosmopolitan and culturally appropriate. The documentation systems that preserved sexual medicine knowledge included not just formal medical texts, but also artistic works, personal accounts, and cultural practices that transmitted understanding across generations. The integration of medical knowledge with broader cultural expression helped ensure its preservation and accessibility. The communication networks that spread sexual medicine knowledge throughout Japanese society included both formal publication systems and informal networks of practitioners, patients, and community members. These networks ensured that medical innovations could reach people who needed them while maintaining appropriate levels of discretion. The feedback systems that allowed sexual medicine to improve based on experience created ongoing cycles of observation, analysis, and refinement that continuously enhanced understanding and treatment effectiveness. These feedback loops were essential for maintaining the relevance and effectiveness of medical practice in a changing society. The adaptation mechanisms that allowed sexual medicine to respond to social and cultural changes were particularly important during periods of rapid transformation. Physicians had to continuously update their approaches while maintaining the core insights that made their practice effective. The support systems that help patients implement medical recommendations recognized that sexual health often required changes in lifestyle, relationships, and social circumstances that went far beyond simple medical compliance. These support systems provided the community assistance needed for successful treatment outcomes. The monitoring systems that tracked long-term treatment effects were crucial in sexual medicine, where the consequences of therapeutic interventions might not become apparent for years. These systems required sustained observation and careful documentation that demonstrated the sophistication of Japanese medical practice. The coordination systems that integrated sexual medicine with other social institutions ensured that medical recommendations were compatible with religious, legal, and cultural requirements. This coordination was essential for maintaining social harmony while addressing individual health needs. The evolution systems that allowed medical knowledge to develop over time created traditions that were both stable and adaptive. The ability to maintain core insights while incorporating new understanding was crucial for the long-term effectiveness of sexual medicine in a continuously changing society. As we examine these medical traditions more closely, we see how they both supported and reflected the broader sexual culture of Edo Japan. The physicians who specialized in intimate health weren't just treating individual problems, but were helping to maintain a complex social system that required sophisticated understanding and careful management to function successfully. The patients who sought this specialized care were navigating relationship arrangements that demanded not just physical capability, but emotional resilience, social intelligence, and cultural sophistication that went far beyond what most people today would consider normal expectations for intimate life. The broader community that supported these medical traditions understood that sexual health was connected to social stability, economic productivity, and cultural continuity in ways that made specialized knowledge and treatment essential community resources rather than luxury services for the wealthy. The integration of sexual medicine with other aspects of Japanese culture created comprehensive approaches to human well-being that recognized the connections between intimate relationships and all other areas of life. This integration produced medical traditions that were uniquely holistic and culturally sophisticated. The legacy of these medical approaches continued to influence Japanese culture long after the specific social systems they supported had disappeared. The attention to seasonal timing, the integration of physical and emotional factors, and the recognition of community dimensions in individual health became lasting features of Japanese approaches to medicine and healing. The documentation of these traditions provides extraordinary insights into how pre-modern societies could develop advanced knowledge about human sexuality and create effective systems for maintaining the health of individuals and communities engaged in complex, intimate relationships. The philosophical implications of this medical tradition extended far beyond healthcare to influence Japanese understanding of human nature, social organization, and the relationship between individual desires and community needs. These insights contributed to broader intellectual traditions that shaped Japanese culture for centuries. The technological innovations that supported sexual medicine included organizational and communication systems that were often as important as specific treatment techniques. The ability to make specialized knowledge available when and where it was needed required sophisticated social technologies that demonstrated the advanced organizational capabilities of Edo society. The economic impact of sexual medicine extended throughout the broader economy, creating markets for specialized goods and services, while also supporting the cultural infrastructure that made complex, intimate relationships possible. The economic value of sexual health was recognized and supported through both commercial and community mechanisms. The educational dimensions of sexual medicine contributed to broader Japanese approaches to learning and knowledge transmission that emphasize the integration of theoretical understanding with practical experience and cultural wisdom. These educational innovations influenced teaching methods in many other areas of Japanese society. The quality assurance systems that maintain standards in sexual medicine provided models for professional oversight and accountability that were applied in other areas of specialized knowledge and service. The balance between professional autonomy and community oversight that characterized these systems influenced broader approaches to managing expert knowledge. The innovation systems that drove development in sexual medicine created cycles of observation, experimentation, and refinement that produced continuous improvements in understanding and treatment effectiveness. These innovation systems provided models for knowledge development that were applied in many other areas of Japanese culture. The preservation systems that maintained sexual medicine knowledge across generations combined formal training programs with informal networks of practitioners and community members who valued and protected specialized understanding. These preservation systems ensured that valuable knowledge survived periods of social change and cultural transformation. The documentation systems that preserved this knowledge were as intricate as the relationships themselves. Scholars and physicians maintained detailed records using coded language that protected privacy while preserving essential information for future generations. These records reveal the remarkable sophistication of a society that could balance individual discretion with collective learning. Consider the challenge faced by a physician treating a high-ranking samurai whose Wakashudo relationship had become emotionally complicated. The medical records couldn't explicitly describe the situation without potentially destroying reputations and disrupting military hierarchies. Instead, practitioners developed metaphorical languages that use seasonal imagery, poetic references, and philosophical concepts to document cases while maintaining absolute confidentiality. These coded records accumulated over decades, creating databases of knowledge that allowed physicians to recognize patterns and develop increasingly effective treatments. A case involving spring thunder during autumn ceremonies might indicate specific relationship dynamics that experienced practitioners could immediately recognize and address appropriately. The training required to master these communication systems took years of dedicated study. Young medical apprentices learned not just anatomy and herbal preparations, but also the subtle arts of diplomatic conversation, cultural interpretation, and social psychology that their practice would require. They studied poetry and philosophy alongside medical texts, understanding that successful treatment often depended as much on cultural knowledge as clinical skill. The examination rooms where these consultations took place were carefully designed to encourage honest communication while maintaining appropriate social boundaries. The architecture itself supported the delicate negotiations required when discussing intimate matters across different social classes and relationship contexts. Lighting was kept soft and indirect to reduce embarrassment. Seating arrangements allowed for both formal consultation and more relaxed conversation as circumstances required. Even the seasonal decorations and artwork were chosen to create atmospheres that would put patients at ease, while subtly communicating the physician's cultural sophistication and discretion. The consultation process itself followed elaborate protocols that balanced medical necessity with social propriety. Initial meetings focused on general health and lifestyle patterns, gradually moving toward more intimate topics as trust developed between physician and patient. The most sensitive discussions might require multiple visits before patients felt comfortable sharing the details necessary for effective treatment. The diagnostic techniques employed in these consultations were remarkably comprehensive, addressing not just physical symptoms, but emotional states, relationship dynamics, and social circumstances that might affect intimate health. Physicians understood that sexual problems often reflected broader life issues that needed to be addressed for treatment to be successful. The treatment plans that emerged from these consultations were individually crafted masterpieces of medical and social engineering. Each patient received recommendations tailored not just to their physical needs, but to their social circumstances, relationship obligations, and cultural expectations. A treatment approach that worked perfectly for a wealthy merchant might be completely inappropriate for a samurai or a courtesan. The herbal preparations that form the foundation of many treatments were prepared according to recipes that had been refined over generations. Master physicians guarded their most effective formulas carefully, passing them down only to trusted apprentices who had demonstrated both medical skill and absolute discretion. The timing of these treatments was coordinated with the natural cycles that governed all aspects of Japanese life. Spring treatments emphasized renewal and the beginning of new relationship phases. Summer approaches focused on maintaining energy and preventing the exhaustion that intense heat could bring. Autumn therapies helped patients navigate the emotional transitions that cooler weather encouraged, while winter treatments addressed the unique challenges of indoor intimacy during the coldest months. The dietary recommendations that accompanied herbal treatments revealed deep understanding of how nutrition affected not just physical capacity, but emotional balance and social compatibility. Patients received detailed guidance about foods that would enhance their treatments, while also supporting their ability to fulfill their various relationship obligations. The lifestyle modifications that physicians recommended often extended far beyond the medical realm into areas of social behavior, seasonal activities, and even architectural changes to living spaces. A patient struggling with emotional balance might be advised to rearrange their sleeping quarters, modify their daily schedule, or adjust their participation in seasonal festivals. The follow-up care that ensured successful outcomes involved regular monitoring and adjustment of treatment approaches as circumstances changed. Sexual health problems rarely resolved quickly, and physicians expected to work with patients over extended periods, developing relationships that often lasted for decades. The family consultation aspects of treatment recognized that intimate problems affected entire household networks and often required participation from multiple people for successful resolution. Wives, apprentices, and even household servants might receive guidance about how to support the primary patient's recovery. The social coordination required for these comprehensive treatment approaches demanded remarkable diplomatic bees of relationships, obligations, and expectations, while maintaining therapeutic skills from practitioners. Physicians had to navigate complex effectiveness and protecting everyone's reputation and privacy. The professional networks that connected sexual medicine practitioners created informal systems of consultation and knowledge sharing that improved outcomes for everyone. Difficult cases could be discussed anonymously with colleagues, leading to collaborative approaches that drew on the collective wisdom of the medical community. The research methodologies that advanced understanding in this field were necessarily subtle and private, but they were systematic and scientifically sound within the limitations of their time. Physicians carefully observed treatment outcomes, compared different therapeutic approaches, and gradually refined their techniques based on accumulated experience. The theoretical frameworks that guided this research drew from multiple intellectual traditions, creating comprehensive approaches that addressed both individual health and community stability. The integration of medical knowledge with philosophical understanding produced treatment approaches that were uniquely sophisticated and culturally appropriate. The innovation cycles that drove continued development in sexual medicine were closely connected to broader social changes. As relationship patterns evolved and new social arrangements emerged, physicians had to adapt their understanding and modify their treatment approaches accordingly. The quality assurance mechanisms that maintain standards in this sensitive field included peer review, patient feedback, and community oversight that ensured effective treatment while protecting professional reputations and patient privacy. These systems reflected the high standards that Japanese society maintained for all forms of professional practice. The economic structures that supported sexual medicine created sustainable markets for specialized knowledge, while ensuring that basic health information remained accessible across social classes. The balance between commercial practice and community service reflected broader Japanese approaches to managing essential social needs. The educational institutions that trained sexual medicine practitioners were remarkably sophisticated, combining formal instruction with extensive apprenticeships that could last for decades. Students learned not just technical skills, but the cultural competencies required for successful practice in a socially complex environment. The international connections that influenced Japanese sexual medicine included awareness of medical traditions from throughout Asia, combined with distinctively Japanese innovations that reflected unique cultural circumstances. This combination of international learning and local development created medical approaches that were both cosmopolitan and culturally specific. The documentation traditions that preserved this knowledge included not just formal medical texts, but artistic works, personal accounts, and cultural practices that transmitted understanding across generations. The integration of medical knowledge with broader cultural expression helped ensure its survival and accessibility. The communication networks that spread sexual medicine knowledge throughout society included both official publication systems and informal networks of practitioners, patients, and community members. These networks ensured that medical innovations could reach people who needed them while maintaining appropriate discretion. The feedback systems that allowed continuous improvement created ongoing cycles of observation, analysis, and refinement that enhanced both understanding and treatment effectiveness. These feedback loops were essential for maintaining medical relevance in a rapidly changing society. The adaptation mechanisms that enabled sexual medicine to respond to cultural transformation were particularly important. during periods of social upheaval. Practitioners had to continuously update their approaches while preserving the core insights that made their work effective. The support systems that helped patients implement medical recommendations recognized that sexual health often required changes in lifestyle, relationships, and social circumstances that extended far beyond simple medical compliance. These support networks provided the community assistance necessary for successful treatment outcomes. The monitoring systems that tracked long-term effects were crucial in sexual medicine, where therapeutic consequences might not become apparent for years. These systems required sustained observation and careful documentation that demonstrated the remarkable sophistication of Japanese medical practice. The coordination mechanisms that integrated sexual medicine with other social institutions ensured that medical recommendations remained compatible with religious, legal, and cultural requirements. This coordination was essential for maintaining social harmony while addressing individual health needs. The evolution systems that allowed medical knowledge to develop over time created traditions that were both stable and adaptive. The ability to preserve core insights while incorporating new understanding was crucial for long-term effectiveness in a continuously changing society. As we examine these medical traditions in their full complexity, we begin to understand how they both reflected and supported the broader sexual culture of Edo Japan. The physicians who specialized in intimate health weren't simply treating individual problems, but were helping to maintain an intricate social system that required sophisticated knowledge and careful management to function successfully. The patients who sought this specialized care were navigating relationship arrangements that demanded not just physical capability, but emotional resilience, social intelligence, and cultural sophistication that far exceeded what most people today would consider normal expectations for intimate life. The broader community that supported these medical traditions understood that sexual health was intimately connected to social stability, economic productivity, and cultural continuity in ways that made specialized knowledge and treatment essential community resources rather than luxury services. And so we reach the end of our journey through the floating world of Edo Japan, where sexuality wasn't hidden behind closed doors, but woven into the very fabric of daily life. From the Wakashudo bonds between samurai warriors to the elaborate rituals of the pleasure districts, we've explored a society that understood something we've largely forgotten. That human desire, in all its complexity, doesn't need to be compartmentalized or shamed. It can be celebrated, refined, and integrated into a sophisticated cultural system that honors both individual fulfillment and social harmony. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be as peaceful as the silence that finally settled over the floating world.